Hello there, and welcome to this interview with Peter. Peter, it's a pleasure being able to ask you some questions because, as you know, I like to be curious, and I'm really excited about what you can share with our audience about the role work plays in our lives as we think about what's next and as we get that little bit older, and some of the factors that we should consider to get more satisfaction out of our work. Because I know we've had this conversation before, that work actually done right can actually play a really important role in our later lives. And I know you've got a certain philosophy of that. First, before we start that, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a great honour. I work as a coach, as a mentor, a business advisor. Lately, I've become a non-exec. And so I've been in the world of working with senior people in organisations for quite a few years, both in the UK and internationally. I know we've talked about this before, but I've wanted to say that I'm not a great one for giving advice.
Yeah.
Over the years, I've noticed a lot of people like to give advice, but not a lot of people seem to take it. So I'm coming at this from the angle that my job is to help people figure things out for themselves, because you know, you're the expert on you. You know what's going to work for you. So let's help you figure out the solution to some of the things you're wrestling with. I just thought I would get that up front because that's kind of my frame.
100%. And I think what we're going to be talking about today, some of the questions that people can ask themselves to find what works for them, and that's sort of where I want to go to. I'm just curious, what does work mean to you, and how does it fit in the general mix of your life?
Well, for a long time, it was too big a part, and I neglected a number of other things. But I think I've been lucky in that I've had a series of very interesting jobs. A lot of them have involved travel, which I like. And so the mixture of doing interesting work in different cultures with very different people, that got a bit too magnetic for me. And other things, including my family, kind of got left behind. I hope I've been getting better at balancing it out.
Yes.
So you see, I'm doing all my confessions up front. I thought that was so.
But you won't be alone, I don't think, because the power of work is that it makes us feel special and important, right? So what question should we be asking ourselves to sort of get the balance in our lives a little bit more appropriately for whatever that means to us?
Well, I mean, there are far more knowledgeable people than me out there. But I mean, one of the things that I like is if you look at Miles Downey's work about genius, when people are asked, you know, name a genius, they name all the obvious ones, Einstein. And Downey started to sort of say, but what if everybody had a bit of genius?
Yeah.
What if there was, thinking about the moments of truth in your work life or in your private life, when it was all in flow, it was all going great. You know, there were moments of genius.
Yeah.
So if you reflect on those, maybe with a mentor or with a coach, you know, let's try and distill it down into the things that, wow, that was absolutely fine. How can I do more of that? How can I go back to it? How can I reconfigure it? Or how can I plan ahead to do more of that kind of thing?
Love that. Absolutely love that. And it's that phrasing. I don't know if it was Dan who talked about this. It may have been somebody else. But that rephrasing of the question, how smart are you, to how are you smart, is an interesting one, isn't it? Because then you're thinking about your unique areas of strength.
Yeah, and sometimes when I'm working with people, if they're wrestling with things and they say, oh, you know, I'm not very happy about blah, 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 you say, okay, what are you most proud of?
Yeah.
You know, get it in a positive frame. We've all done things that are fantastic. we've all got things that we're proud of. So instead of focusing on this isn't working, let's pull back and put the camera up at the sky and say, let's look at some blue sky here and ask ourselves, what are you proud of? Or let's ask, well, what's stopping you?
Yeah, they're great questions. I love that. And it's finding that sweet spot, isn't it? Getting the balance right, finding the sweet spot, and looking at where you can actually, if you wanted to, continue work as part of the balance of your life, but doing it in a way that's productive. Help me understand. I know you do a lot of work with leaders, and we have this conversation before about the word resilience and the way that often it gets overused. What does resilience mean to you in a positive light, and how should we reframe it to make sure it's something that we can use more constructively?
After we spoke about this, I actually did the old trick of looking it up in the dictionary.
It's a good starting point. Great starting point.
and there is an old word called pliancy. And it's not a word we use anymore, but that's where the word pliant comes from. And it's about being pliable. It's about bouncing back. It's about readjusting, coping with, getting back to. Because I think you and I had the conversation that resilience has now come to being, tough, armor-plated, blah. Yeah, but I think if leaders that I work with have to manage, enormous amounts of change. They manage huge incidents where all of a sudden, a company's reputation is at stake. Well, it's no use just being tough about that. No. You have to be able to think about it from different angles. You have to be resilient in the sense of saying, okay, how do we get around this? What are we going to do differently? How do we cope with it?
I suppose part of the challenge with that, and again, it's been a historic change for the positive, but the problem with that type of style of management and leadership is it doesn't bring people with you, right? So you're in a position where, if you're managing a team and you want that team to come with you, just saying this is the direction we're going without managing the emotions and the dynamics of the team is an interesting one. What's your take on that?
I was working with a big, well-known company, and somebody appeared on the scene in a very senior position, adopting exactly the style of leadership that you're talking about, which was, get behind me, I'm in charge, this is the way we're going. That person didn't last very long.
Yeah.
And when I interviewed other people, I said, how did people respond to that guy's style of leadership? And the most interesting answer that came up was with a degree of incredulity. They weren't angry. They weren't mad. Yeah. They just went, "What?
Yeah.
Are you serious? You actually think I'm going to continue working here? What?"
Yeah, it's really interesting when I look back and I look back at my career. One of my favourite ever bosses, the first thing he did when I walked into the office, and it was a big corporate organisation and he was quite a senior leader, is make me a cup of tea. And it's interesting how that he said, right, come on, before we do anything, come with me, we'll have a cup of tea. And it's interesting how, I mean, I'm going back 20 odd years now, that still has an impact in terms of just the way you treat people and what you want to get. It's really interesting.
I had a similar thing when I worked for Bank of America many years ago. When I went to work for them in the States, I met my new boss, JB Woods, and I went into his office in just outside San Francisco. And I thought, oh, this is the big guy here. And he shook me by the hand and said, "Hi, how are you doing?" So I said, "Fine." And he said, "Okay, let's go and get coffee and bullshit for a while."
And then it breaks some barriers, doesn't it? That's the
after that you thought, well, this is going to be fairly honest. If a guy could say that on first meeting,
exactly.
It was a nice touch.
One thing I'm curious about, and sort of encountered it quite a lot, where clients come to us, they know they need to get financially organised, and part of that is getting their business organised as well, because for a lot of clients, their business value might be part of their financial plan, but they just don't seem to find time. So we live busy lives. We're in a position where we're trying to work out sort of what's next, but we just haven't got the time and the headspace really to work out sort of what might be next. What questions could we ask ourselves, or what steps do we need to take to make sure that we're in a position where we're finding that time?
I think it has to become a matter of routine, because every senior person I've ever worked with has always said, I need to work on the strategy, I can't get time, there are too many interruptions, you know how it goes. And I think the question is, how much longer can I go on without having that strategy?
Yeah.
So I know of one organisation where everybody talks about the 5-year plan. In actual fact, they're 3 years into it. So it's now the 2-year plan.
Yeah.
And I think we all need to look at time in the sense of, you know, those great variables of time and money. Well, if you're not putting the time aside to look after the money, and if you're not putting time aside to do the planning, then it's hard to see how you're going to be successful.
It's really interesting.
I think there's some behavioural things about having a bolt hole, having a place you can lock the door, colour coding your diary and defending it fiercely. That's at a practical level, but I think you're right. Get the frame up here that sort of says, how much longer can I go on in this position? Yeah.
That's a great question, but I think you're right. That habit of and in financial planning terms, we've got a concept called pay yourself first. So pay yourself first is about making sure that if you've got a financial goal, you're committing to that financial goal as soon as the money comes in. So when the money comes in, get rid of the bit that you want to invest for your financial future and make sure it's there. And it's just one of those habits that is not about money. It's about a mental shortcut to make sure that you're not having to worry about it. I think that certainly in my life, that certainly applies with time. Diarise the stuff that you think is important first, because then you can you'll actually do it, right?
Yeah. Well, a light went on in my head many years ago when I was blithely talking about time management in a meeting somewhere. And somebody said, well, of course, there's no such thing as time management. And everybody stopped, and it's just become almost a cliched phrase. And this guy said, well, if you could manage time, you'd make Tuesday a bit longer than Wednesday. And you'd make Saturday and Sunday, each the length of 3 days. And you could bing light bulb. And, what I learned was that the correct definition of it is personal organisation.
Yeah.
You can't manage the time, but we each have 168 hours in a week. How can you get organised to make the best use of them?
Yeah, I like that. I like that. It is about organisation. It's not about time management. I love that. A lot of clients who come and see me, Peter, are in a position where they've in positions of responsibility and influence. They've done really well throughout their careers. But when they sit in front of me, part of the reason might be that they've fallen out of love with what they do. They're going in. I had a really interesting conversation with a client last week, a brand new client, and said, and the question that I normally start a meeting with is, what specifically is the reason you're here today?
Right.
And the reason I ask that is because I know how tough it is for people to sit in front of people like you and I. It takes a lot, particularly people who are senior and are in positions of responsibility, to turn around and go, I need help. So to do that, I always start with that question. And his answer to me was, I'm having a lot more bad days than good days, and I need to make a change.
Wow.
Now, part of that might be helping him understand where he is financially, but part of that might be him recognizing how he spends his time at work and maybe making some changes there. So help me understand a bit about how, for somebody like that who's having more bad days than good, the questions that he might want to ask himself to think about what's next for him.
Yeah. Well, I think in that situation, I'd be tempted to use that old comment, tell me more.
Yeah.
And when he replies, probe into it, dig into it. Oh, and when did you notice this? Because the other thing is that phrase that he used, I'm having more bad days than good days. That's weighted with meaning.
Yeah.
But is that actually the need? Because, you know, sometimes it takes a while for people to actually finally say, well, to be honest, what I wanted to talk about was this. Because often the presenting issue is okay, it's an issue. But if you can get them moving, you then start to get through to something that's probably a bit more meaningful. Maybe you're helping them figure out what is the cause of this feeling.
Yeah.
Because I think until you get further into it, you're in danger of tinkering around with stuff that's on the surface.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
And also maybe ask the question, well, if you couldn't fail, what would you do next?
Yeah, really like that.
You know, and I love the way that you've called this series, What Happens Next? Because for a lot of people, that's a very big question.
Yeah.
You know, I'm working with somebody at the moment who's a CEO, and what happens next? You know, another CEO job, or move into the world of being a non-exec. But I mean, after you've been a CEO for a while, you could kind of get used to that lifestyle, you know?
Yeah. And I suppose the other option is to carry on what you're doing, change how you spend your time by being more conscious of what you do. So what would if you got to the base issue, and the base issue was, I'm not enjoying this anymore.
Right.
How would you support that individual to get to a point where they were either making change so that they were doing something different that they were enjoying, or potentially changing their role so that they were doing something they loved?
Yeah. Well, again, let's try and help them figure it out, because it feels to me that the circumstances of what you were doing 5 years ago are different from the circumstances now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's do the gap analysis of saying, okay, well,
what's changed?
Is it the what, the who, the when? Was there a significant moment when something happened? And also Simon Sinek's great thing about what's your why?
Yeah.
You know, why did you start doing this? Why did you like it? Why are you not liking it now? I think, again, you know, get people to actually inject a bit of new thinking, because I think the problem with the situation you're describing is that I sometimes think when you're on the down cycle, it's difficult to see a way out of it.
Yeah, no, completely get that. And coming back to that, and this is why when we talk about what happens next, we talk about the interconnection with all those elements, and the bit in the middle is purpose and values. You know, why are we getting up in the morning, and why are we spending the time doing what we're doing? And if that's changed, and for some people it has changed, do we need to change what we do, or do we need to just change how we spend our time?
And all the other thing that somebody mentioned to me in a global IT company, and he was bemoaning his role. He was vice president, I think, and in the midst of this discussion, he stopped me and said, you know, this used to be a really great technology company. So I said, okay, used to be. What is it now? And I'll miss out some of the expletives. It's like, you know, we're all trying to be consultants now.
Right.
And, you know, in the way he said it, you actually thought, here's somebody that's regretting the way things are now, who is looking back to the days of the great technology company. And now,
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's interesting because all businesses tend to evolve, don't they? So it's like what happens when it becomes, you know, you've got this startup tech business that becomes an incumbent, and the excitement goes potentially from the job. You know, it's just it turns into a different role. So what do you do about that?
Well, I think one of the, having worked with a few, I liked Robert Donnelly's description that a lot of these companies are started by what he calls the founder and the soul brothers or soul sisters. In that it's a group of people, they get together, they like each other, they work well together. And then it takes off. And long story short, what Donnelly says is, you know, be prepared for the fact that somebody is going to, quote, go back to the lab.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody will actually want to go back to the engineering, the technology. They don't want to be doing calls with analysts on Wall Street. Yeah. And I think it's about having a group contract to give each other the freedom to be, so that people can say, you know what, I'm not having any fun anymore.
And it's interesting because I've had clients who we've helped who have left leadership roles because it just wasn't their sweet spot. And I think often work culture can encourage us to think about the next step, what happens next. It's just the next rung on the ladder. How do you think? Like, what other ways can we look at how we do things to make sure that we're aware that effectively we're not just taking another rung up the ladder, we've got the ladder up the right wall.
And it's the right ladder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, it's just that we all know the cliche of, you know, you promote the best salesperson and they end up being the worst sales manager.
Yeah.
You know, in which case you've lost a good salesperson and you've now got a rotten sales manager. I think organizations have woken up to the fact that in the past, it was all about getting to management. And, you know, that's where a lot of things started to go wrong. So I think you have to present people with several ladders. One of them is continuing to be an individual contributor.
Yeah.
As an engineer, scientist, whatever it is you do, and be more rigorous in explaining to people that, yes, management might come with kudos and more rewards, but it comes with a hell of a lot more responsibilities, and that really isn't everybody's sweet spot. So I think better vetting of people, more use of psychometrics, more use of assessment centres to let people have a try at some of these things. You might, and also have a culture in which it's okay to say, you know what, this isn't for me.
Yeah.
Without there being, you know, a downside and HR put a black cross on your file or something.
Yeah. How if we're thinking about changing our lives, should we start that conversation with either the board, if we're leading a business, or a manager if we're not if we're senior in the business but not leading it? How do we start that conversation that means that either our jobs get better, our work gets better, or we can actually make change?
Have you got any easier questions? These are getting...
No. Because I suppose the challenge that a lot of people face is they're in a situation where they understand that they get real satisfaction from work, but they're not in a position where they're enjoying it today. So but then we, you know, that no man's an island, right? So we've got to have conversations with people around us to support us to make the change we need to at work and in our lives. So how do we start that conversation? I'm an MD. I'm in a position where I know that I'm not spending my time as effectively as possible, but there's an expectation on me from the board to do what I'm doing. How do I then shift to work that I truly love?
I encourage people to sit down with their mentor or coach and do something basic like a SWOT analysis.
Yeah.
Or a force field analysis.
Yeah.
So that you're actually spending time digging into strengths and weaknesses, or what's helping, what's hindering, because that way you can then prepare for that conversation. And by prepare, I don't mean write a list of things. I mean actually practice saying, what tone am I going to bring to this conversation? What outcomes do I hope for? How do I build some rapport with the board, which is often not easy, especially if you're the MD. But I think it has to be really thoroughly thought through in advance, because otherwise it can get emotional, things get blurted out, feelings get hurt, and it makes the situation a lot more difficult.
And I suppose the other thing is look at it from of the board and the business, right? You know, consider those perspectives before you go in and have a conversation, so that you can sort of preempt some of the potential objections, some of the challenges, some of the thinking about solving the problems before they come up is what business owners and leaders do, managers do, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've worked with people on what we call the 3 positions. So let's start with talking about me, then let's go and sit the other side of the table and look at it from the point of view of the board. And then let's imagine that we've got a camera overhead looking down on this discussion. What do you want to see through that camera? What sort of collaborative discussion? What sort of rapport? And how are you going to make sure that you bring that to the discussion that you've got with the board?
No, I love that. Absolutely love that. That 3 hats is a really, really good way of doing it. We've talked quite a lot about strengths and weaknesses, and you mentioned earlier on some of the tools that you could potentially use to help identify your own strengths and weaknesses, as well as people you work with in the team. When you're working with a client and they are not clear on where they're strong and where they're potentially not as strong, what tools do you use to help them identify that, and what should people be considering looking at?
I like to, if I'm going to use questionnaires, I tend to use behavioural style questionnaires like LIFO or FIRE-OB. They're not as intrusive as some questionnaires are. And what they do is they give you a picture that says, this is what it's like to work with Chris.
Yeah.
And you see the patterns. I mean, in LIFO, it talks about this is how Chris operates in normal conditions. And these are his strength areas, and this is where he's not so good. And this is how he operates in stress conditions. Now, for an MD, that's often the way they are operating. Short of time, short of resources. So let's look at the pattern of your behavior when you're under stress. And what does that tell us about you? And the other thing that I encourages people to think about is, and I'm a bit of a behavioralist at heart, is that sometimes those weaknesses are actually strengths that you've overextended.
Yeah.
So Peter is confident. Peter becomes more and more confident, and more and more confident, and more and more confident. And suddenly people around him are saying, whoa, overbearing, dominates the conversation.
Bullish. Yeah.
So how can you get off the throttle so much?
That's a really interesting perspective.
Otherwise, the danger is that, when you start talking about weaknesses, it all gets a bit negative and what can I do about it? As opposed to sort of saying, well, in Peter's case, he dominates too many conversations because he's just too confident now. How can he skinny that a bit?
Yeah, no, I like that. And that element of just curiosity, who would you ask that question of? Would you ask it of the leader, or would you ask it of their team, or would you do both?
We have an online 360 feedback system. Right. So just before we came on, I'm working on one from somebody, and it's a couple of people above her, a couple of her peers, a number of people that report to her, and some people that report in from other parts of the business.
Yeah, interesting.
As long as you set it up very, very carefully and you've already got that relationship of trust, and they've said, yeah, I want to do this, because in some organizations it kind of gets foisted on people. Yeah. And so they're not necessarily going to like it, and they're not necessarily going to like the results, and it can have the opposite effect that you actually wanted.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. If you're an individual considering what happens next in your life, we're talking about people, and I'm going to talk about sort of leadership of teams and teams in a little bit. But if you're thinking about what happens next in your life, who would you, thinking about that, making that change, consult? Because clearly, if you've got a coach, your coach is one, right? They're going to help and support you in that journey. Who else would you talk to about what happens next in your life?
Well, I know some people that talk about having the board of Me Inc. Yeah. So talk to Chris, because financial planning is bound to be a part of it. Maybe you want to talk to somebody who's got a legal background.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to talk to somebody else who's a specialist in the field you've been working in. Or somebody that's got a particular background in medicine. And that might sound quite sort of cold and functional, but I've had a number of instances over the years when people have said, oh, I don't need all that. What I do is I put on my wellies and me and a friend go and walk through the fields. And that sounds lovely. But can a friend really be as objective and independent as somebody who's Chris, who's he's a great guy, and I've noticed you're very good at building rapport, but he's also bringing a certain professional independence to it.
Yeah,
and I've heard a lot of walking in the fields with a mate and everything else, and not convinced.
Yeah, I think the challenge there is that element of challenge. Is your friend going to actually ask the sometimes difficult but important questions when you're thinking about what's next? And the answer is probably not, because they're going to be conscious of their relationship.
Or they think they already know those answers because they've known you for 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm still learning to do this. I don't think I'll ever stop. But that element, Peter, of just being able to take your perspective off your table. If I look at the hats that I wear in my life, it's easier to do that as a professional financial planner, more difficult to do that as a friend. So actually, I think that's the benefit working with professionals, but that's interesting. And if we're thinking about,
well, sometimes people ask me about if I'm working with them in whatever capacity, how's this going to work? And I say, well, on the one hand, I'll support you. On the other hand, I'm going to challenge you.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if it's all support, that's just a birthday party. But my independence means that I should be able to say the unsayable.
Yeah. 100%.
Because there are things going on in your business that I found out about and nobody's talking to you about it. In fact, these are things that aren't actually talked about.
Yeah.
And I'm the one that will ask the stupid questions and say the unsayable and say, oh, by the way, I observed that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we build a financial plan, if we work out that individual is going to run out and hasn't got enough, based on the assumptions we've made and the science we've wrapped around building that plan, our professional obligation is to say we need to take action to make change before you start making change in other areas of your life. That's just it's the reality of it. I think not always being. It's really funny. I sometimes describe our job and my personality as two completely different things. So personally, I'm an optimist. In my working life, I need to be a professional pragmatist. and that element of saying, look, we'll just tell you what assumptions we've used, tell you what story it tells, and then build your plan to move forward. However, I'm always optimistic about the ability to make change. So that element of saying, well, look, if we are where we are, let's focus on what we're going to do moving forward, so that we can get you closer to where you want to be.
Yes.
Interestingly, a lot of the people who come and talk to me about their financial plan are in positions where people are often the joy in their life, but often people also the frustration often, particularly when they're leading large teams. So help me understand how we can get better at managing teams and sort of working on the leadership skills that we might need to improve the way that we enjoy work.
Well, one of the things is I'm a great believer in getting together with the team as often as you can.
Yeah.
I think that gradually you can build up what in some disciplines they call a script. It's not a script that's written down, but it's kind of a contract, a charter. We all know where we stand with each other. And, a lot of the work we're doing with leadership teams now is, post-COVID, got teams that are working completely remotely. We've got people working together who've never met. Well, you have to have a way of actually saying, how are we going to do this? And, a CEO who I coached, used to talk about the idea of a trial close. Rather than saying to people, this is what we're going to do, he would float a number of ideas, and informally as well as formally just sort of collect the feedback that said, what do you think about this? And I think when we're talking about teams, it's also, you need to think about the leader working within the team and outside the team. Yeah. So what are those different relationships? How can those relationships gel? And how can people feel that, we talk about, there's a difference. People talk about teams and you say, okay, tell me what you mean. And sometimes you look at a group and you say, that's a group. It's not a team. It's a collection of people. And who was it used that expression? It can be a bus queue or an air crew.
Yeah.
An air crew is a team because they're depending on each other. A bus queue is a bunch of people who happen to be in the same place.
Yeah.
And so I think creating a charter, a script, an understanding of how we do things around here that everybody nods to, that's a start. That's
fantastic. I think there's a bunch of things that I've really enjoyed from today, but the big one for me is creating your team that is me Inc. and making sure that you're in a position where you can actually rely on a bunch of people to support you through whatever decision you need to make and get different perspectives is a really interesting one. So thank you for sharing your insight today. It's been really amazing.
Really enjoyed it. It's made me think a lot as well. So thank you for inviting me. It's absolutely great. Well done, Chris.
You're welcome. Loved it.
Take care.